Morning.
Morning.
Okay, well, it's been an interesting week, and Max was in Mom's absence last night, being very helpful in making sure that we investigated the back rooms to make sure she had not magically appeared, and kept going outside, asking to go outside, I think, to relieve some tummy anxiety distress and check and make sure she wasn't out there. So it was a little interesting working on the lesson last night and this morning, so bear with me and help me out where I stumble. Okay, we're in God's glory and the coming Christ in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, and we are in 732 BC at Jerusalem. And I spent actually where am I here? PowerPoint. Hang on. There we go. So I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out the political and historical circumstances, because you kind of got to read Isaiah not only in a spiritual sense, but also in a sense of what was going on at the time, because there are a couple of possible meanings to Isaiah's prophecy, and it's kind of important we understand it in both contexts. But let me back up a minute. When we remove the modern distractions of celebrating Christmas, of which there are a lot, we need to remember what a good opportunity this season offers us to share the good news of Jesus with our unsaved family and friends, because there are a lot of them. Some of them, fortunately, are saved, but a lot aren't. And, you don't need to make a huge production of it, but you can kind of low-key slip in the good news without maybe creating World War III at the dinner table. And I encourage you to do that. Now, as for this week's reading, again, like I was saying, we need to remember to read these verses both from the perspective of the prophet Isaiah's audience, who saw the initial fulfillment of the words back in the world of the 8th century BC, but we also need to remember to try to understand it from the perspective of the latter revelation of Jesus' complete fulfillment of this text. And about that, there's a couple of different interpretations. Now, the period of the prophet Isaiah was somewhere around 760 to 673 BC, and primarily he was active in 701 to 861 BC. And the why of the book of Isaiah was to convince the people that salvation was possible with repentance and hope in the coming Messiah. Isaiah is divided into three main parts, and this reading, chapter 9, is firmly in part 1, condemnation. And part 2 is comfort in exile, part 3 is future hope. So he kind of leads everybody through things. And Isaiah is known as being the prophet who predicted the virgin birth of Jesus, his spirit-filled mission, his dual nature, his death, and his millennial reign. So we're really squarely dealing with at least part of that, the first part of that, in our reading today. And again, I spent probably more time than I should have last night and this morning kind of trying to wrap my head around what was going on at the time. Now, we're 10 years prior to the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel to the Assyrians, which happened in 722 BC. And we're right after the reign of King, Pekah, I think is how you're supposed to pronounce it when I looked it up this morning. And we're during the reign of King Hoshea. And he ruled from 732 to 722 BC, which is basically the fall of the northern kingdom. Now, in the southern kingdom, were in the reign of King Ahaz, who ruled from 735 to 716 BC in Judah. And King Hezekiah's reign was immediately in the southern kingdom. It was immediately after that, from 716 to 687 BC. So you can see in the map here, the light green was the existing Assyrian Empire. The darker green was where it was starting to expand at that point. And the red indicates the northern kingdom of Israel, and the white right below indicates the southern kingdom of Judah. I was in a few different books looking stuff up. All right, so Assyria is banging on the door of Judah and Israel. And Israel and the northern kingdom, Hoshea, became king after assassinating King Pekah. At first, Hoshea served as a puppet king under Assyria, but eventually he rebelled against Assyria and negotiated an alliance with Egypt. He was trying to cut a better deal. And then you have the Assyrian king, Shalmaneser, besieging the capital of Samaria, and Hoshea was captured and imprisoned. And the Assyrian king laid siege to Samaria for 3 years and then finally captured it and exiled the Sumerian inhabitants to locations in the Assyrian Empire, which was kind of the practice that day, because remember, I think we talked several lessons ago about, at that time, kind of the prevailing thought was gods with a little g were more local. And when you removed people who were conquered geographically far away from their homeland, that kept them away from things familiar. They kept them away from any support systems that they might have had that still existed, and it took them away from the influence of whatever their local god had been. So that was pretty common. Now, in this period, we have Judah and the southern kingdom. We have Ahaz, the son of Jotham, and he had adopted policies that favored Assyria, and he refused to join the anti-Assyrian alliance that Pekah of Israel and a ruler in Syria were supporting. And those two anti-Assyrian alliance, those two besieged Jerusalem and tried to dethrone Ahaz. They were spreading the joy. So in defense, Ahaz requested help from the king of Assyria because, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I think was the theory he was going with. And that plan did work when Assyria invaded Israel and Aram, but Ahaz had to pay tribute to Assyria's king. And I think at some point he decided maybe he didn't want to do that anymore, and there goes the friendship or alliance. So that's kind of the background of what was going on at that time. We start off with gloom to glory. And in Isaiah's time, his audience most likely understood this chapter 9 to be talking about Hezekiah, the son of King Ahaz, and the future ruler of the southern kingdom of Judah. Hezekiah had initiated religious reforms during his reign, restoring forgotten biblical practices, and he exercised his authority on David's throne according to God's commands. In the face of the mounting Assyrian force, the promise of Hezekiah's reign might have sparked some hope among some despairing people, because the Assyrian Empire was just stomping all over everybody in their path, they weren't feeling really optimistic. But within their lifetimes, Isaiah and the people saw God realize this promise. During Hezekiah's reign, Assyria set its gaze toward Judah. And after stomping Judah's allies, like I said, Assyria tore through the cities and the stronghold that protected Jerusalem. When the Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, the Davidic king and his people turned to God. And they're like, oh, wait a minute. We got this God guy. He's going to protect us. Now we remember him. And as we see later in Isaiah, God destroyed the enemy army and saved his people from defeat. But Hezekiah wasn't the final fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, as Hezekiah's government ended. Neither was any other king the final fulfillment of the prophecy. Isaiah's prophecy was finally fulfilled when Jesus of Nazareth stepped onto the stage. So we start out in chapter 9, verses 1 through 2, living in darkness. Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Nebulun. It sounded a lot better at 6 o'clock this morning. In the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. A little geography here. So you have Naphtali in the orange on this map, and right below that in the purple you have Zebulun. And Naphtali, if you see kind of southeast of Naphtali, that's the Sea of Galilee. This is the region that we're talking about. Okay, going on to verse 2. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. So again, you've got Nebulun and Naphtali, which are ancient tribal territories in Galilee, in northern Israel, and a region known for its trade routes, and later where Jesus began his ministry. Zebulun and Naphtali had been brought into contempt through invasion, displacement, and resettlement. It wasn't well regarded. And those who rejected God and his word turned to Assyrian religious practices like necromancy. Had to look that one up. And that is a form of magic focused on communicating with the dead, and historically it was for divination about the future. They were trying to figure out what was going to happen. And also it involved superstition. That God wasn't going to abandon these folks that turned to the Assyrian religious practices. He didn't write them off, at least at that point. He was trying to bring them back into the fold. Despite his people's rejection, God would intervene in the gloom and the darkness and restore them. And out of the gloomy Galilee would emerge the light. And that light was Jesus. Jesus would make them glorious. Now, this darkness that they're talking about in verse 2 didn't only describe the political oppression from the Assyrians. Like much of the Bible, it also described the spiritual plane. And here specifically, it describes their spiritual darkness, their rejection of God, and their embrace of sin. And again, and yet God's refusal to abandon them. Jesus directly fulfilled these verses 1 and 2. He lived in Galilee, which was the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, fulfilling what Isaiah had prophesied. Then Jesus began declaring the coming of the kingdom of heaven. The great light Isaiah describes here is Jesus in the coming of that kingdom. In verses 3, 4, 5, we go to bringing joy. Thou hast multiplied the nation, and not increased the joy. They joy before thee according to the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Okay, so how was the nation multiplied and made joyful? Well, joy is the easy one to answer. Jesus' work increased the joy of people of all over the world, including the southern kingdom of Judea. But what about the harder question of the nation multiplied? It wasn't that Jesus brought about a Jewish state by defeating the Romans militarily and establishing political dominance. Because remember, as Cliff has told us for a long time, the Israelites and the Judeans were looking in the Messiah. They thought they were going to see either a military powerhouse who was going to kick butt, take names, and get the Roman boot off their neck, or they were looking for a political powerhouse that was going to take the power away. Not really what they were expecting when they got Jesus, so a lot of them missed it because of that. And it's also, this multiplying of nations is also puzzling because God always oversees the size and the influence of nations. But obviously the Jewish nation did not increase with Jesus' first coming. But we need to be careful not to repeat the mistake that a lot of the first century Jews made when they're awaiting the Messiah's coming. Not all Old Testament prophecies about Jesus were fulfilled during his first coming, during his earthly ministry. When he was born, that was just the first coming. He's not done yet. Some of these Old Testament prophecies are not going to be fulfilled until Jesus' second coming. So just because he has not multiplied the nation yet does not mean that he's not going to do so one day. We just may not be there yet. Hopefully he doesn't turn the car around and go back home, but we're not there yet. Now, some emphasize the different aspects of the nation multiplied question, but those really aren't in conflict. But even if they, regardless, God's going to keep his promises in all ways and keep them in a manner more glorious than we can imagine. Some say that the kingdom of heaven has come to many nations. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. And one day, people from all of these nations will praise Jesus together in eternity. Others say that the nation of Israel itself is going to be blessed. Could be either, could be both, could be something else we just haven't figured out yet.
When I see this, I'm looking at dual prophecies of the past and, before Isaiah's time and the future yet to come. But what really stands out to me is that the joy is according to the harvest. And that's the harvest of not material things. That's the harvest of
spiritual things,
of people,
which
they have not done.
True. But in moving on to the harvest, Isaiah also says that the people rejoice as they did at the harvest. When God gifts us things, and he gifts us things both earthly, as in the harvest itself, as in actual food, or in the harvest of spiritual learning and enlightenment, both planes, we should give thanks and rejoice in those gifts, both the earthly and the spiritual. So, and I think that first part about multiplying the nation, Scott, as you've talked about in some recent sermons, you have to look at them, well, it's happened once. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to happen again, because it's probably gonna. It happened once, why would we think it wouldn't happen again? So, there's that continuum and the repeat sometimes. But why does the nation rejoice? It's kind of a question. Okay, verses 4 and 5. For thou hast broken the yoke of his burden, and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise, and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. All right. So the Assyrians often imposed heavy yokes or burdens on those that they captured. It wasn't like they stood up at the end of the game and shook hands and said, good game, and they both went home. Didn't work like that. You lost, you really lost in those days. Isaiah described Assyria as the rod of God's anger. Because remember, the people weren't trusting in God. At best, they were hedging their bets. So, God may have been, Isaiah saying that Assyria, breathing down their necks and conquering or potentially conquering them. I mean, they did the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom was definitely in jeopardy. So Isaiah is saying, Assyria is God's rod of anger. You have ticked God off, and here is the consequence as he's trying to get your attention. And the day of Midian refers to Judges 7, when God reduced Gideon's army from 22,000 down to only 300. I think we had a lesson on that at some point here in the last couple of years. And God just whacked out most of Gideon's army, from 22,000 down to 300. That's a big reduction in force. But God wanted to underline, and with 300, that's seemingly impossible odds. He wanted to underline when Gideon won over the Midian, it wasn't Gideon's military strength or his brilliance. It wasn't Gideon doing it. God delivered his people from Midian. It was God's doing. And likewise here, Isaiah is saying, like with Gideon in Midian's, God's going to deliver his people from Assyria. When God breaks the staff of the oppressor, it's God doing the breaking, not us. And some could argue that this breaking of the oppressor's staff was fulfilled in Jesus' first coming, that by his perfect life, his death, and his resurrection, Jesus defeated Satan and freed people from captivity, from spiritual captivity. But others argue that this verse is about Jesus' second coming, not the first. Just as war has not come to an end, this verse remains for the future. But regardless, Jesus is clearly this passage's final fulfillment. Whether it's the first coming or the second coming, the answer is Jesus. It's not who, it's when. So, kind of begs the question, how are the promises of these first 5 verses fulfilled? The answer, through the arrival of the child described in verses 6 through 7. A son is born. We've got kind of 4 aspects of one verse, verse 6. And this is the key verse in the entire book of Isaiah. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So, and here's where Maxie's constant interruptions show. We've got the Wonderful Counselor. In the original Hebrew, there were no commas, so, is it, I was sitting there eating breakfast and doing some more reading, and the meme that you guys may have seen popped up in my brain, my little wacky brain, about the comma. Have you seen the "it's time to eat, comma kids" versus "it's time to eat kids"? Commas do make a difference sometimes. But God is wonderful. He's also a counselor, but I think that the phrase goes together, that he's a wonderful counselor, is probably the correct interpretation, because opinions are readily available. Doesn't necessarily mean the advice somebody will readily give you is good, but God gives really good advice and guidance. He is a very wonderful counselor. and truly quality counselors who give quality advice are a lot fewer and further between.
See, I believe that the comma's there.
Do you believe the comma's there?
I think he's wonderful
Well, yeah.
where he was, and he created miracles out of one door. And then he was a counselor because when he was here,
Mhm.
he gave counsel all the way through.
Yeah, I think both meanings are correct. I mean, they're certainly defensible, and they're certainly correct, but I think that wonderful was an adjective describing the counselor, and would be a little bit more in line grammatically with the rest of the verse. But Jesus wasn't just necessarily a favorite of God or had extra wisdom. It wasn't that he was extra smart or extra knowledgeable or superior in applying that. He is wisdom. And he has there's nobody comparable to him in advising us. Okay, second, mighty God. How could this baby be the God who created everything? This baby that we saw on the earthly plane be the spiritual God who created everything? And Isaiah, later in the book, hammers that out quite a bit. But he also says that this child is God. This baby that shows up in Jerusalem is God. And Jesus is God with us. He's the eternal God who always existed. And he's the God who is willing to humble himself by taking on a human form on earth. But in doing so, he did not lose his divinity. And this verse 6 is actually one of the few places in the Old Testament that hints toward Jesus' deity. He's all at once, at the same time, truly human and truly God. Now, we may not necessarily be able to wrap our brains around that fully, but we have to remember both. And everlasting Father. Now, mighty God is definitely a clear declaration of Jesus' divinity. Everlasting Father as a title for Christ, for Jesus, is a little less straightforward. Yeah, God's the Father, Jesus is the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and Jesus the Son is also God, and the Holy Spirit is God. Yet they're all distinct. It's not one person who simply reveals himself in different ways at different times. In verse 6 here, it poses kind of a challenge because it calls the Son the everlasting Father, which kind of trips us up, but this verse does not say that the Son and the Father are the same person. In the ancient world, not so much the way we think these days, but in that time, the term father was a common designation for the king. So Isaiah is described a ruler as a father on the Old Testament. A similar function for people in authority in the Old Testament was a, well, let me go back and restate that. So, a father or king, it was a similar function for people in authority in the Old Testament. So, yeah, you can look at Job. You can see the suffering servant. The suffering servant sees his offspring being crushed by God. And those aren't his physical descendants, but the ones that God has delivered. So God protects and provides his offspring through Jesus, through his death. Jesus, the suffering servant, delivers us and is therefore our Father forever. And Jesus guides and protects us, and nothing can change his fatherly relationship with us. And then also we have Jesus described as a Prince of Peace. When Jesus was born, a large heavenly army declared peace on earth. Now, a little over 2,000 years later, and obviously we've still got wars. So what kind of peace did Jesus bring? His suffering on the cross earned us peace with God. Peace with God now, but one day he's also going to bring us a full and final peace on earth. So we've already got the spiritual peace, or at least he earned that for us, whether or not we're smart enough to take that. But in that second coming, we're going to have the full and final peace on earth. And he's going to bring us harmony and order. It's a pretty big order. Jesus fulfills all that.
Let me comment on that.
Yeah.
If you read that verse that they're referencing here in Romans 5:1, therefore being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's when Christ died on the cross. He gave us peace. We have peace with God.
Mm-hmm.
To me, what that means is the wrath of God ceased on the person that is justified by faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at Isaiah, when we talked about the first 39 chapters about judgment and wrath, right? And then the next chapters are about grace, okay? So it kind of rolls in here what Isaiah is saying with the, Prince of Peace, that he brought peace for the believer that is justified by faith, all right, that we don't get the wrath of God, is what it means to me, okay? And it has really, I don't think it's spiritually, and I don't think it's our inner peace. It has nothing to do with our humility and inner peace. It's that statement. It has to do with the peace that was brought by not having the wrath of God for the people that are justified by faith, is the way I view it.
I think that's part of it, but I think it's also inner peace. I think it's all encompasses everything, because that's who he is. He is peace. He's peace because we don't have to go through the wrath. He's peace because we can have a peace that passes all understanding because of him, knowing that there is something that follows this life, and that the peace that we have inside of us is bigger than what's going on externally. All the peace that comes along with being one of his, that's who he is. He is that peace. the peace that we can't even explain because it's so vast. But I think it is a lot of what you said. That's where it all begins. That's the core of it. Starts with that, for sure.
I think you can, I think, like most of the Bible verses, you can read both meanings into it, the earthly plane and the spiritual plane. Now, which takes priority or which we should emphasize is, I think, a matter for debate. Okay, and we have his kingdom. Of the increase of the government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So Jesus' government and his peace will never end. His kingdom one day is going to fill the entire earth, and it's never going to be destroyed, unlike our human governments. Our human governments may last for a really long time, they may have a heyday, but eventually they fall into decline and they crumble and end. Not so here. They're going to cover the entire earth. It'll have dominion over everything, and it's never going to be destroyed. And this kingdom is going to be the fulfillment of the promises made to David. Because Jesus' second coming isn't isolated. It's just not New Testament only. It's also Old Testament. And it's the grand fulfillment of everything we learned about in the Old Testament. God is going to enthrone Jesus through his zeal, not ours. We don't have to worry whether Jesus' final victory is in jeopardy because we've screwed something up. We're not that important. Jesus' victory is certain. It will happen. And that's what it's going to look like at the end. Okay. So sorry for fumbling at the end there. I spent the vast majority of my time at the beginning trying to kind of wrap my head around what was going on at that point in the world. But yeah, in terms of figuring out what the lesson means, God's discipline doesn't mean that he's abandoned us. I would argue actually the opposite. You know, just like a parent with an unruly, undisciplined child who sticks in there and still disciplines the child because the parent cares enough to do that. That's the opposite of abandonment. Abandonment is if you have a parent who just says, this kid is beyond me, I can't do anything with him, and just lets him run willy-nilly and, you know, continue doing all the bad things that should be corrected. That is abandonment, and God doesn't do that with us, fortunately. God can rescue people even from the darkest circumstances. Despite our best efforts to mess things up and to make it impossible to rescue us, God will rescue us. And we need to rejoice and give thanks for God's blessings. And God's going to end all warfare and oppression. Obviously, we're not there yet. We're getting there. We'll eventually get there, or actually he will. We're just along for the ride. And we can be confident that one day Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises, and he's going to bring the victory. And it's God who brings his kingdom, that we can seek the justice and righteousness that characterize his kingdom. We can practice, we can try to get ready, we can try to emulate, but in the end, it's God that's gonna do it. And again, hopefully we're along for the ride. So, I'm sure I missed stuff. Oh, come on, guys, I'm not that smart.
I think you did good.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you very much,
Thank
and Merry Christmas.